So I want to say a few things on the latest. Just that knocked my laptop there. If you're wondering about the sudden thrust, want to say a few things about the latest revelations of Tory Sleaze, and I think that's a fair way to put it. Um, and honestly, the more that comes out, the more or less rather likely I am to consider voting Tory. The one thing that makes me sort of wonder is there something in their appeal is that they are the only major party that is anti-woke, that is willing to speak up against some of the divisive sort of things that come from the woke left. Certainly the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats won't. In fact, they often embody it. Um, I also think that despite their largely failed record, I still think overall the Tories are most reliable when it comes to law and order. I mean, I think the heart's in the right place, but the record is a lot to be desired. Labour's talked tough recently, but I don't know. Talking tough is one thing. I think there needs to be a commitment to tough justice, which is something I believe in strongly. But that's not what this video is about. Well, actually, it's not totally unrelated because we are dealing here with law breaking. Namely that the people who set the laws broke them. And I have to say, to me, this is just corruption. And I do think the Conservative Party, more than the others, have an entitled sense of power. Now, you can find examples where in local seats and local constituencies, there's a certain degree of complacency with the sitting party. Here in Sunderland, in my ward has recently had a by-election, and it was very, very close. The Labour candidate won, but she beat the Lib Dem by only 13 votes, 15 votes. So it's very thin in this city, although it's a Labour-held city, has been for the last 60 years. But definitely Labour has been tested in the last sort of 2 years. Ironically, part of that was from Boris Johnson visiting in the 2019 general election. That now seems a long way back because so much has happened. I think Boris Johnson had the potential to be a great prime minister, actually. Some of the things he done do warrant praise. His robust and consistent stance on Ukraine definitely warrants praise. The handling of COVID now, notwithstanding the things I'm going to be talking about, which I think are a disgrace, but in terms of the vaccine rollout, he deserves some credit for that. His government deserves some credit for that. It will be easy to sort of say, oh, this many people shouldn't have died, but I think it was an unprecedented situation. Maybe there should have been lockdown earlier. The lockdown itself is now subject of significant debate. I mean, the effects it had on mental health, for example. To what extent did it save lives? That's going to be for debate. I am convinced of one thing: we should never go through that again. I think the British people sacrificed enormously. We should never have that situation again. Um, so no doubt mistakes were made. I think it is right that there is a public inquiry. I think it is right that something on this scale, where potentially 250,000 people died, absolutely there should be an inquiry. Um, it's not about blaming the government. It's about just preventing mistakes in the future, knowing how best to deal with this sort of situation. I don't think it's about blaming the government. Um, some critics will frame it that way. I don't think it's that at all. In fact, I think it would be unfathomable that you have a situation where you have a deadly pandemic that's killed tens of thousands of people, crippled the economy temporarily, and really, really had a bigger impact on public life than anything since the Second World War. The idea that there shouldn't be some sort of inquiry into this, into the government handling of it, into how this could be handled in the future, seems ridiculous. Um, so Boris Johnson has been banned from Parliament for 90 days. In some ways, it seems sort of counterproductive. Firstly, because he's announced that he's stepping down anyway, so we sort of jumped the gun on that. Secondly, Parliament's in summer recess, but It is quite a tough sanction. I'm just looking at the longest suspensions. This is, as reported by the Times on June the 16th. Faz 6 months, and that was for his express willingness to purchase cocaine for sex workers in 2019. That's actually the longest, but Boris Johnson is second after that. 90 days if he was still an MP, misleading Parliament, and then there's a list of other MPs. Honestly, this whole Partygate thing, I don't even think that Boris Johnson is necessarily the most culpable. The problem is he is the Prime Minister on whose watch it occurred. And I do think that Boris Johnson is a compulsive liar. There's a op-ed comment piece by Ian Martin, also in the Times, and the headline is, "He sees the truth as a silly detail for lesser mortals." And I think that sums up Boris Johnson's arrogance. Of course, he's rubbish the Sue Gray report. He said it's a vindictive witch hunt, and I think he's stoking up supporters. But this is a man who has always lied in public life. I mean, as a journalist, he was fired. I think it was the Daily Telegraph for making up a quote. I've trained as a journalist. If I had done that, I'm starting off. I wouldn't dream of doing that because it would basically blacklist me from the industry. Somehow Boris Johnson has always got away with things. Um, I do think he's a compulsive liar, and I think this has been shown many, many times. And the thing that I find quite frustrating about the whole Boris Johnson saga is that, there was potential there. I don't think he's stupid, actually. I think he's pretty cultured. But that's combined with the sort of just William Manchild persona. For a very long time, his eccentricities were almost a selling point. The fact that he was different from all other politicians, he was colourful, he was bombastic. But I do think there's something Trumpian about Boris Johnson, in the sense that he's now riling up supporters. And they are extremely, from what I've seen, just they have this tunnel vision that the more Boris Johnson is penalised and the more that is revealed, the more they shout it's a witch hunt. It's almost like he can do no wrong. And that to me is just, I don't think personality cults are healthy in a democracy. And this can be echoed, I made this video recently about personality cults in politics. This can be echoed certainly with Trump, but also Bolsonaro in Brazil, Berlusconi in Italy, definitely Boris Johnson in Britain. Um, it can be seen around the world, Modi in India. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that it's an exact template. That is to say that each situation is exactly the same. For example, I don't think Boris Johnson supporters are about to storm the Houses of Parliament. I don't think it's quite as bad as the Trump situation in America. But they are very stubborn, and no matter what evidence is presented, oh, it's a witch hunt, witch hunt. Some national papers, the Daily Mail, I think, is guilty of enabling this sort of mindset um, because he's a man who, brought us Brexit. But Brexit isn't even finalised. I mean, the American trade deal hasn't gone ahead, so it's not finalised in that sense. Part of me feels sorry for Rishi Sunak because, he's been Prime Minister for almost a year. He's had to deal with basically the hangover of Boris Johnson, and in that sense, it's similar to Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Much of Biden's presidency has been overshadowed by Trump's legal hearings. No matter what Rishi Sunak does, I mean, the Northern Ireland Protocol, I think that went as far perhaps as it will go. I think Sunak deserves credit for that. But, instead of getting credit, everything is overshadowed by Boris Johnson. Um, Distancing a pantomime for cameras, Chris Smith. Number 10 was in an oasis of normality during the pandemic when COVID precautions were ignored and social distancing was a pantomime, largely put on for the cameras, an unnamed official said in evidence to the Privileges Committee. What I find infuriating, and just for the record, I didn't lose anyone personally in COVID, but many, many people in this country did. The Johnson loyalists, their attitude is, oh, it's the past, let's move on. But I think that is like rubbing salt into the wounds of people who lost loved ones. People whose relatives died during the pandemic, can they move on? Should they be expected to move on? I remember a case of a 15-year-old boy who died in, I believe it was in London. He was a Muslim, so in their tradition, burial needs to take place the following day. His family couldn't see him because of the social distancing rules. He was only 15 years old. They were obeying the regulations. There was another case of a student who was fined £10,000, £10,000 for holding a lockdown party. Now, I'm not saying he should have done it, but it's infuriating to see the double standards. And this has just emerged now. Okay, Mir is a partisan paper. It's a pro-Labour paper. This is a party at Tory HQ. Among those in attendance were Sean Bailey, the failed candidate for Mayor of London, and also Ben Mallet. Both these men were at this party. It was in 2020, at the height of lockdown, when the rest of us were, most of us, were obeying the new regulations. I went out a few times. I had to get food, but we all remember what that was like. It was like a scene from 28 Days Later. The country it was just locked down, and then you have members of the very party that set these regulations basically living it up. And obnoxiously, they were caught on camera saying, "Oh, can we get away with this?" And something to the effect of, "As long as it's not recorded." That's a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. Now, Bailey and Mallet were apparently on Johnson's honours list. They should absolutely be struck off that, without question. And I think everyone who is revealed in that party should lose their jobs. Um, it's not good enough to say, "Oh, well, 3 years ago." This was at a time when, you know, ordinary members of the public were threatened with hefty fines and police visits if they broke the regulations. And what is absolutely infuriating is the double standards of it. So those Johnson apologists, those people saying, "Oh, just move on," they don't get it. They don't get that members of the public, it's a perception of double standards. Now, Michael Gove has apologised and he said it's disgraceful, and he hasn't, to be fair, he hasn't tried to make any excuses. He's the levelling up secretary, but I think it just adds to the perception of Tory sleaze and this mentality of one rule for us and another for everyone else. I mean, how many Tory ministers are going to be linked to wrongdoing and get away with it? Suella Braverman, the whole speeding points thing. It doesn't matter that she paid the fine. The fact that she got civil servants to basically spare her embarrassment just shows this Tory arrogance. And I'm sick of it. Um, it just fuels corruption. Um, so I think definitely the people exposed in this, they need to lose their jobs if they haven't already done so. Um, as for Boris Johnson, of course he's going to say it's a witch hunt. But the fact of this, it's entirely of his own making, the fact he is in this situation now. Back in 2021, when Partygate was first exposed, Johnson could have just fessed up and said, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake." Well, made a mistake. That's kind of a euphemism for I got caught out. But even if he'd apologized then, it would have spared this situation from developing. But he didn't. He dug down. He denied everything. And what's happened 2 years later? He's had this heavy sanction from Parliament, and then he presents it as a witch hunt. Because in Boris Johnson land, it's always someone else's fault. I think it's pathetic. Um, Although I must admit, I was mildly amused by the fact that Nadine Dorris was left off his honours list. She must feel that as a little bit of a, slap in the face, given that she has been such a cheerleader for Boris Johnson. But do these people not have a conscience? They must have known this is Tory campaign HQ. They must have known that ordinary people were subject to strict regulations, and there they are living it up. It's a it's an absolute disgrace. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. But if the Tories lose in 2024, I think that this constant sort of trickling of sleaze is going to be a big part of it. Now, the caveat here is Labour has to be whiter than white. Starmer has to take a zero tolerance policy to criminal wrongdoing within his party. Um, his record hasn't been squeaky clean in that regard. I would cite the case of several, Labour councillors involved in. Well, I'll give an example. The Wakefield Grand Scruff incident not long ago. Actually, this does differ because it's not so much criminal wrongdoing, but one Labour councillor was talking about, bringing in police and bringing in all the authorities to investigate this hate incident, and it was basically inciting inciting tensions. Starmer did not rebuke that councillor. Now, it's a bit different because it isn't involving criminal wrongdoing, but I think that the 2024 election, I think corruption or the perception of Sleaze is going to be part of that. And for Johnson loyalists, or even for Tories in general, even Sunak loyalists, they cannot say, oh, this is just Labour playing dirty tricks. They have to understand they've been in power for 13 years. And Sunak's not squeaky clean himself. He was also fined for COVID related um, wrongdoings, although not to the extent of Johnson. Um, I think if I were Rishi Sunak, that would be one of my priorities, would be really, really cleaning up the image of his party. The fact that Suella Braverman, a woman who was already forced to resign due to breaching the ministerial code of conduct, yet somehow comes back to Rishi Sunak's cabinet, it's incredible. I think there's an attitude among Tory members, and I say Tory members because they're the people who, vote in, um, voted in Sunak and before him Liz Truss, and they wield a lot of power actually at the moment. They have this attitude that if a minister delivers, oh well, we can turn a blind eye to the wrongdoing. I say, why not have a situation where they deliver whilst there is not double standards on wrongdoing? This idea that oh well, they break a few laws here and there, or they're involved in sleaze or corruption, but they're a good minister, they get results. That's absolutely staggering. It's basically saying as long as they get results, the end justifies the means, basically. Um, I basically take the view that if you're setting legislation, you should damn well stick to it. I'd hold the same principle, incidentally, to police officers who break the law. Police officers who break the law should be arrested. There should be no special treatment for corrupt cops. I hate abuse of power. I hate it. And we do see this in public life. We see it in politics. We see it in the police. And it's wrong. It's just plain wrong. So let me know your thoughts. But just spare me this Boris Johnson, the victim narrative. It's nonsense. I mean, a while back, the Daily Mail was, talking about one of the Tory MPs, I forget who they named, who himself was being investigated over lockdown violations, who apparently is pushing for Boris Johnson sanctions. But that's frankly, it's it's tabloid fodder in the sense that saying, "Oh well, this person's also corrupt." Yeah, it may point to an agenda, but it doesn't negate the fact that Boris Johnson is corrupt. Boris Johnson is a liar. I think for this reason, he had the potential to be a great prime minister. He had a very comfortable mandate in 2019. He was a larger than life character. He had a lot on his side, and he was genuinely quite popular for quite a while. But the sleaze, the constant lies, it just, there was a whiff of, I don't know, deep arrogance about Boris Johnson and about his supporters, and I don't think that should be normalised in British politics. I really don't. Incidentally, in terms of foreign policy, he got it right on Ukraine. Boris Johnson flip-flopped on China. His record in China was a lot to be desired. One day he spoke tough, one day he. The example here is Huawei. His flip-flopping over the Huawei deal is a good example of this. Um, so I'm not a fan of Boris Johnson. Whatever he delivered, I think that it was really overshadowed by his dishonesty. So yeah, my message to Johnson supporters, I mean, this Uxbridge by-election, Johnson will probably win, but what does that tell us? That the people of Uxbridge, the good people of Uxbridge, with all due respect, they're basically brushing aside Johnson's corruption. Oh, he's a character, he's a good MP. We don't care if he breaks the law. And technically they're right. If he gets elected, then he gets elected. But we cannot have a situation where anybody is above the law, including former prime ministers. Let me know your thoughts.